Welcome to my flipped classroom. This video is about growing sectional differences. So you should take out your interactive notebook and in it title it Growing Sectional Differences. And we are still pre-Civil War. And if you're using your book, it's on pages 229 to 238. And in that interactive notebook, you're going to take 3 pages and make them into a section for a timeline, because we're going to be keeping a timeline of events throughout the pre-Civil War and then the post-Civil War era. And so that's your first task. Create 3 pages for a timeline. Your second task is to mark 3 pages off for vocabulary enrichment. So we're going to have lots of terms and legislation associated with the Civil War. You need at least 3 pages to fill in for your vocabulary enrichment. And the third thing is what we're going to do right now together, and that's creating a graphic organizer about those growing sectional differences. So on one half, you're going to have the event, and on the other column is going to be the summary. The events that we're going to talk about today are the Tariff of Abominations. That's the first one. And then leave, I'd say, 4 or 5 lines. And then make one for the nullification crisis, space it out pretty evenly, and then conflict among states. How did all of this tension begin? It began with the reliance on cotton in the Southern economy and the profitability of cotton due to slave labor. So although in 1808 it became illegal to import slaves from Africa, the cotton production continued to grow because the value of slaves was higher and slaves were having children, and children of slaves became slaves. But you can see a rapid increase here in the cotton production and how much it was worth. So in 1820, there was $22 million each year profited from cotton production and sold to other countries such as England. And then by 1830, just 10 years later, it had increased 10 times to $20 million per year in all of the southern states, generating from cotton. And I have some more statistics for you about the pre-Civil War South. So at that time, only 25% of Southerners were slave owners, and in Georgia there was 3,500 free African Americans. They were given freedom for different reasons, but they still had to register as freed slaves, and they didn't have as many rights, they didn't have rights even though they were freed. They were still considered less in society than even really poor white people. And in Georgia, there was 600,000 white people, and there were only 3,000 planters. And so the planters were the class of people who owned plantations, and they grew cotton, pecans, peaches, any of those things that we were farming. And so your first vocabulary enrichment term is sectionalism. Sectionalism was the loyalty to the concerns of your own religion or section of the country rather than the whole nation. Sectionalism is loyalty to the concerns of your own religion or section of the country rather than the whole nation. So in Georgia, sectionalism was experienced because they had preference and priority for their own needs, and that was the cotton and relying on slavery to produce their economy. And in the North, sectionalism would have meant seeking their own needs for factories and manufacturing. So they were losing money because they had to pay to import goods at higher prices, while the South was making money by exporting goods, and so it was a greater profit for the South. And this led to tension between the North and the South, and it resulted eventually in 1828, Northern manufacturers received a tariff from Congress that raised prices of the products sold in America. So if we were selling a bale of cotton for $10, the tariff meant that when England bought that bale of cotton, it cost $50. So it dramatically increased the prices. And that's just an example. But in the North, this was good for them because it meant that they were receiving more money for their goods because they had been struggling in that area. So cotton prices were raised, and this made the South very angry because they felt threatened by it. And they were threatened because if the British didn't want to pay for high prices for Southern cotton, they could pay for prices for like Egyptian cotton. And now Egyptian cotton leads the world in cotton production. So you actually have seen over time that shift in cotton production. And that tariff, passed in 1828, was called in the South the Tariff of Abominations. But I can imagine that in the North it wasn't called an abomination. And Southerners were so unhappy with the abomination that they threatened to secede. And this is not succeed like I was successful on my project. This is secede, S-E-C-E-D-E. This is one of your vocabulary enrichment terms. To secede means to leave the Union. So the South was threatening to leave the United States of America and form a new country. And the Union the president at the time was Andrew Jackson. His vice president, Calhoun, was from South Carolina. And Calhoun believed that the states did have a right to leave the Union. And that nullification is one of your vocabulary enrichment words. He believed that the states had a right to nullify or reject federal law. So he's saying that it is our right as a state to reject the federal law. The federal law comes from the national government and applies to all states, but he believed that as a state he could reject that. And so we get into another cause of the Civil War, which was the argument over states' rights. And what is a state right? States' rights are privileges that states possess about governing themselves, and they can do this without interference from the federal government. So there are certain sections now that we have states' rights for. And all of this made President Andrew Jackson really angry, as you can imagine. If his vice president was saying that you don't have power over me, that could cause some offense. And so at this point, Calhoun, who is from South Carolina, was only rallying South Carolina against the federal government. This was not yet a Confederate States of America. And Andrew Jackson, the president, was threatening to send military force into South Carolina because he said, no, you cannot secede from the Union. You cannot become the state of the lone state, the lone country of South Carolina. It was not yet Confederate States of America. And so the southern states proposing this caused conflict among states. This is part of your graphic organizer. So there was a conflict between Georgia and South Carolina. I have a quote from a primary document, and that says it's from one Georgia legislature to the South Carolina. And he says, "We abhor the doctrine of nullification as neither peaceful nor constitutional, but on the contrary, as tending to civil commotion and disunion." So essentially, Georgia was saying to South Carolina, stop, don't do this, you're violating the Constitution, and it's not peaceful, it's going to cause civil disunion. So what we see not many years later was that coming true. It was a civil disunion, it was not peaceful, there was not a compromise made in this situation, and it caused the Civil War in the United States. So tomorrow is Thursday, the 13th, and your ticket in the door is your completed graphic organizer. So if you were following along, what we talked about was the Tariff of Abominations, the nullification crisis, and the conflict between states. So you need to have the event and the summary of the event written there. And then as we had talked about several dates, you should include those dates in your timeline and those vocabulary enrichment terms that we discussed in the video as well. That's what you're responsible to bring to class tomorrow. Without that, you can't come in. So if you're watching this, you know that though. All right, and then what we're going to be doing in class is we're going to be moving between, the classroom will be set up in stations, and you will move from station to station, and it will be about the causes of the Civil War and the factors that contributed to it. So we'll be doing some exploration through the stations, and I'll have some old photos as well to look through. They're really cool. So thank you for watching, and I hope that you are prepared with your ticket in the door. If you have any questions, email me at megan, megan.oshea@bobcats.gcsu.edu.